Hey friends, if you try to ask hard questions about your faith only to run into a roadblock somewhere, sometimes it's just simple answers that people give you. Sometimes it's others who don't even want to ask those questions or entertain them. And sometimes it's your own heart begging to keep life simple. Our guest today says it's worth asking the questions and offers a path through the uncertainty. You're listening to Halfway There, episode number 367, Angela Herrington, and accepting your questions. Hey friends, welcome back to Halfway There. This is the show where we have honest conversations with ordinary Christians about today's Christian experience. I'm so excited that you are here, that we are going to have this conversation together. You are absolutely invited into that, so you can always go to halfwaytherepodcast.com, show notes, click the link for this page, this episode, and you can comment, you can share, and tell your friends about this episode as well. All right there. Appreciate it. As always, you can also hit the Patreon button if you want to help support the show. A few of you do that. Really deeply appreciate the support as well. Okay. I'm ready to, let's just dive straight into our conversation today. This is going to be a great one. Our guest is a faith deconstruction coach, and she's the host of the Deconstructing Faith Summit, who helps people break free from toxic religious culture and empowers them to recover from church hurt. That's a term we're going to have to talk about because I don't particularly love it. Maybe you don't either. Her first book is called Deconstruct Your Faith Without Losing Yourself. And it's out shortly, but this month with, so February, as we're recording this in 2024, it's available probably wherever you can get it right now. Our guest is Angela J. Herrington. Angela, welcome to Halfway There.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
I am excited as well. Okay, I'm just going to start where I kind of pointed out already. Church hurt. This is a term that I don't particularly care for, but I know that's a popular one. How do you feel about it? Like, when you hear that, what do you hear and say?
Yeah, I think one of the hardest things about kind of being in the deconstruction space is finding words that accurately reflect what's going on. So for some people, church hurt makes sense, right? That was one of the first terms that they had. For other people, church hurt feels like maybe something that's happened to us in a way that we're powerless. And so what I would say about that term is use what works and toss out what doesn't.
There you go.
Really what I'm describing when I talk about church hurt is harm that's been done by a religious organization, whether that's a university or a church or a school or even some of the nonprofits. That bottom line is that harm is being done, and specifically in religious environments, harm is being done, and oftentimes the actions are blamed on God, right? Like God gets the credit for what's being done, and it just gets a little twisted.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So in that context, that makes sense. Where I have seen it used occasionally is derisively, right? Like, oh, you just have church hurt, like as if it didn't matter because it's church hurt. That just makes me a little angry. So
yeah, I find that with every term that's designed to liberate people from oppressive structures, it gets co-opted and turned into this like, man, like you're just being moody. You're just a baby, like suck it up kind of thing. So yeah, I've heard it that way too.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is kind of interesting. So I'm sure we'll get into more stuff about particularly the American Evangelical Church, which I think is where a lot of this stuff is happening. Pretty good. The generally as a culture, it's pretty good at adopting terms and changing them. So I think even I find often, really, I am sort of a classic evangelical by training and by upbringing and kind of in my commitments. But those things are not what the churches are anymore. American Evangelical Church is actually quite fundamentalist, which is a little bit different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's words are really powerful and important, but they're not stagnant. They're not made out of concrete. They don't stay the same. And so having the flexibility to recognize something that felt sacred and holy and comforting a year ago is now trashy and insulting on the internet is really important to understand that we're just never going to stay the same with words. It's always going to be shifting on us.
Yeah, that's an interesting point too, because the way information travels faster, it can change faster too.
Exactly.
Maybe that is true. Okay. Well, all this is very interesting. We're going to dive into not only the book, but also your story and kind of what your accomplishing with your coaching clients and what you're hoping to help people do. But I know you're in Indiana now. You grew up in Indiana. Is that where you're from?
I did. I spent the majority of my life here. I was actually born in Illinois and had a short stint in Nebraska, just for
So
randomness.
sorry.
But yeah, rural Northwest Nebraska, like out in the middle of nowhere. It was actually wonderful. We went back a few years ago to visit.
Yeah.
It was great.
Oh, that's good. Yeah. Well, we drive kind of through there. My daughter went to school in Nebraska in Hastings. And so we drive, we're in Colorado and we drive out that way quite a bit. So I get that. Okay. Growing up there. So, but Indiana's kind of sort of, wouldn't say it's the buckle of the Bible Belt, but it's absolutely sort of in sort of a Christian culture kind of a place. Did you grow up in a Christian family?
I grew up around the church. So I had grandparents who were deeply embedded in religious communities. My parents and my siblings and I, not so much. I was definitely the VBS kid. I would go to grandma's for Easter kind of thing. So I was kind of on the periphery, but like you said, it's Indiana. We are deeply steeped in fundamentalism, and you don't even ever have to step foot in a church around here to be saturated in evangelical conservative Christian beliefs.
Yeah, which is, for me, that's really interesting as a, I don't know, as a growing up as a culture warrior kid, right? And kind of being taught some of those things that there is a culture, a evangelical culture of its own.
Yeah.
For sure. Okay. So you grew up in that. Did you have a faith conversion experience of your own?
I did. Mine was at VBS. And it's hilarious because I was a huge fan. I'm aging myself. I was a huge fan of Puff the Magic Dragon when I was little. That was one of my favorite shows and one of my favorite songs. And I went to a vacation Bible school where there was sort of this knockoff Puff the Magic Dragon.
Yeah.
That was the theme. And I probably was 5 or so, maybe 6, maybe 4. I know where we lived, but I don't exactly remember how old I was. And that was me answering the altar call. And it was just a very simple thing to do. It made sense. I was emotionally moved, but not like chaotic, right?
Mm-hmm.
I didn't feel pressured or anything. And it just felt right. It felt right to me.
Yeah. Okay. So, and I'm sure this was a celebrated moment and so then did you go to church after all that or what happened?
Nothing really changed in the day to day. Like I said, I still did the VBS. I still went to grandma's for Easter, but didn't really have spiritual practices at home. And we moved a lot, so I never had a home church. My grandmother's Nazarene church in a rural community is kind of home church for me, but didn't regularly attend anything in our own community. wasn't connected, wasn't embedded in that faith community.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so then how did it start to become something that you, how did you start to grow in your faith? What did that look like?
So I got involved with a youth group in high school for a little bit. It was sort of a social thing, but there was some definite learning that happened there. When I went to college, got married, got divorced very quickly. Then my husband and I, my current husband, we met and settled down, started to have a family, and decided that it would be great for our kids to be in church. And so it was kind of like, we didn't have this. His story is very similar to mine growing up. We didn't have that culture and that embeddedness, but we really wanted it for our kids. And so we started going for them. Why did you
want that? What did you want from that?
I felt like it was something that I felt like there was a connection. I felt like there was a community, and I felt like it was something that would be really positive for them in the long run. So it wasn't just, hey, let's get you in church so you can have friends. It was so many people that I loved and respected are deeply embedded in their church communities. And I didn't have that growing up. So I wanted that for them, even though I didn't actually fully understand what it would look like.
Yeah. So it was a community piece, it sounds like, for you, something that you were looking for.
Well, it was a community piece, but there was also this steadfastness that I noticed in some of my aunts and my grandmothers who were, like I said, deeply connected to the church, and just spiritual matriarchs in our family. And matriarchs overall, but specifically, they had a piece. They had an anchor, a positive anchor that I didn't have. And again, I didn't really know what that was, but I knew that it was connected to their faith. And so that was kind of what I was longing for my kiddos. And then once we started going, I found it for myself too. And so it kind of was a missing piece in my
Mm.
life that sort of fell into place because I wanted it for my kiddos.
How did you find it?
I think my story is pretty traditional, pretty common
Which is
for
okay.
people who come into the church later.
Yeah.
I started going just to Sundays, then was invited to a Sunday school, and then was invited to a small group, and just was nurtured in a lot of ways. The other thing that may not have been so healthy, but I think is also common, is I had felt like an outsider the majority of my life. So when I showed up at church and they were kind of saying, okay, here's the lines, stay inside the lines, here's how you become part of our community. It felt great. I was like, oh my goodness, somebody is finally telling me the rules to belong. And so what I look back now and see was kind of some legalism,
Mm-hmm.
felt really safe and really secure. And so I didn't have to try as hard to figure things out. And I think that that is where some of the peace came from initially. And then some of the peace was just having the space to have conversations and learn about things that I had always heard about on the fringe of life, but not actually had the space to dive into. So talking about the Bible, talking about faith, talking about prayer and just spiritual development. I knew it was out there, but I was never actually connected to it in a way that I considered it my own part of my own story. And church, joining that church brought us into that experience as a family.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. So it sounds like it was something you were looking for and you kind of found it, and that was really helpful. I love what you said that, oh, somebody's finally telling me the rules to belong, right? That's
Mm-hmm,
really
mm-hmm.
powerful, and it can feel really, that can be really comforting, right? If I just do these things, then I'm good.
Yeah, yeah, and especially for someone who moved around a lot and
Mm,
didn't have, I don't have a group of people I grew up with. My husband does. We live in my husband's hometown. And
yeah.
so he knows people that he knew in kindergarten. My kids, we've lived here their whole life. So I know people whose children are the same age as mine, and I've known them since they were 6 months old.
Yeah.
I didn't have that growing up. And so there was this sense of just being untethered. And I think the church, the community aspect of the
Mm,
church was being tethered and being surrounded and being connected to people in meaningful ways. And then the spiritual aspect was, again, all these things that the people I love and respect so much anchored their lives in. And I didn't have that. So let's go in there and see what that's about.
yeah. Did you do all the things, going to Bible study, serving in the nursery, doing all the stuff, or what did you
I
do?
did not serve in the nursery because I have 5 children. I did about everything else, but that
Right.
was like, man, like Sunday morning, somebody else needs to take my babies. But
Fair.
yeah, my husband and I both got involved. We were on boards and meetings and committees. And I think that's where it started to crack a little bit. The behind the scenes conversations were sometimes they were troubling, and not necessarily the questions that were coming up, but the answers that were landed on didn't feel like they aligned with what I heard when I first walked through the door.
Mm. Okay, give me an example of that incongruity that you're thinking of.
Yeah, there were a lot of things. I think the one of the most frustrating things for me that felt like it was really a no-brainer was when the church decided to build an addition, significant size. We had a ton of infants and toddlers coming in who were, of course, going to stay in the church and become teenagers. And there was just a whole lot more youth space that was needed. And when this was being built, the decision was made by the committee to not put an elevator in because it was too expensive. So the youth area was going up on the second floor. And at the time, we had a mama who used a power wheelchair, which weighs a ton. You can't carry those things. And she had children who were going to be in this youth programming and had been raised in that church, and her parents had been in that church forever. And I remember sitting in the meeting and saying, hang on a second, why aren't we doing this? And the decision was made that the money would be better spent elsewhere, adding a coffee bar, adding um, just some different things that were great, but but did not have the same impact and did not have the same accessibility as putting in an elevator. So there was an elevator shaft put in, but not an elevator. And at the time, the church even hosted Special Olympics meetings all the time. So there was just this disconnect of like, how are we embracing our community and intentionally, knowingly saying that group of people's needs are not as important as some of the prettier things that we're doing.
Wow.
Yeah, it was hard.
That's fascinating. Elevators are expensive. I get it. But also people, like we got to take care of people. And I would think there were some, they must have, it doesn't matter. I was on a school board once where our school was intentionally built too small to need an elevator.
Oh,
right.
yeah.
And then when they added on, they had to add an elevator. But
yeah, I mean, $20,000 is a lot of money, or maybe it was 40. I remember it was a lot of money, but in $1 million build, don't put the coffee bar in. You already have a full kitchen that can serve 200 people at a time. Let's think about this. Let's think about what we're prioritizing. And maybe prioritizing it isn't even the right word, but let's think about the harm we're doing. Who are we excluding by these decisions that would not be excluded if we made other decisions?
What was it about that really is that what bothered you? Is that really kind of stuck in your crown, kind of started to crack some things open?
That happened, I would say, probably about halfway through. I think there were other pieces, there were other decisions made about single parents who were in leadership positions in the church. There were other conversations there were just some conversations that were just showing some real assumptions about people who had different experiences. And there were so many beautiful things in that church that the hardest thing was to reconcile the love and the mentoring and the acceptance that we were receiving with what we were hearing behind the scenes and how we were seeing other people being treated. Yeah. And I think what was really the straw for me was one day I just thought, okay, if I had walked in here before I was remarried, if I had walked in here when I was at my lowest point and I'd gone through a messy divorce, I had 2 kids, I was not stable, would I have been welcomed or would I have been a project, right? Would I have been welcomed and embraced the same way that I am right now? Or would it have been, let's welcome and embrace her and support her to help her get her life right, in air quotes, right? And seen as almost a ministry project. And I couldn't 100% say that I would have been welcomed the same way I was welcomed as a married woman with a gaggle of kids.
Yeah. Yeah. Talk about, why is it such a problem to view people as projects?
Yeah, it's rooted in white saviorism. It's called white saviorism a lot, but even if we go beyond that, it's rooted in this colonialism that says there is a group of people who are better than others. And part of being better than others is this holy mandate to go out and save people. And when you talk about saving in that context, you're talking about wiping out their culture and replacing it with white Christian culture. And that seems like a lot. People are like, what are you talking about? But here's the thing is, when we look at the harm that we've done as a church, like global church, so much of that has been looking at people as others, othering people and putting them in categories, and then seeing how we can go save them from themselves in a way that protects the hierarchy without actually sitting down with somebody and saying, hey, what do you need? Is there a way I can help? It's no, we know what that person needs, and we're going to build a relationship with them specifically to convert them to whatever belief system or lifestyle we think they need, because what we believe is holy and nothing else is.
Right. Yeah.
No short answer. Sorry about that. If you wanted a short answer.
That's great. I don't mind. We're here for, I like to have a long form conversation. I like that. I think, I think part of the problem is, I think you're getting at this, is that when we look at people's projects, we think that it's often done with an air of superiority, right? This is what you're saying.
100%. Absolutely.
The way I see the world is the only way to see the world.
Yeah.
And as I've learned about people, like, look, everyone is just trying to make sense of what they see. right, of what
Mhm.
they experience. And so the key really, and I think we even see Jesus doing this, although he does, I think, shape people's perceptions and change their perceptions, uh, and bend them quite often. But is the more proximity we have to somebody, the more we can understand where they are and what they are. So one of my favorite passages, just as an example, is in Mark 1, where a leper comes up to Jesus and says, "Hey, if you're willing, you can make me clean." And Jesus,
Mhm.
it says this text um, actually says Jesus was indignant by that. And so we have to ask the question, like, why was Jesus indignant? That's a strong word, right?
Yeah, that is.
He was indignant because this guy is an outcast, right?
Mhm.
And hasn't been touched. And so he touches the guy, which he was not allowed to do. And which I think says a lot about the way he was accepting that person as a person,
Mhm.
very differently. So, which that's what I'm talking about. He just kind of bent the rules so that he could
Yeah,
serve this person.
right.
And that character is missing when we feel like we're superior to, or our needs matter more than others' needs.
Absolutely. And I think where it gets really messy in the church is that we are taught that that sort of structure, that sort of conditioning that we're discussing
Mm-hmm.
is actually holy. And that's what it means to die to ourselves. And that's what it means to be good Christians. And I think what's missing is a really humble understanding of how so much of what we act out in the church has been influenced by power, political power, financial power, I mean, capitalism, like all these things. And so when we uphold that hierarchy, even if we are not like, hey, we're superior to them, if it's all happening on a subconscious level, right? Even if the church is considered the safe, best place for people to be. And so we're going out and trying to bring people in for their own good. If we don't wrestle with how much harm has been done in the past, by doing that without honoring people's own autonomy and ability to make decisions, then we're just reinforcing that system and we're
Right.
doing harm without intending to. Very few, from my experience, very few Christians set out to be malicious in this way, but we can only pass on what we know. So if we're
Mm.
taught this is the way to do it, it's really hard to get out of that mindset and do it differently.
Yeah, 100%. Okay, so you're in this, and you're kind of starting to ask these questions, going, "Hey, that doesn't seem right
Yeah.
to me." How much longer did you stay in that, and when? And then take us up to like where you really were. Okay, we got to
Uh-huh.
make a change here.
So we did this great Bible study with a handful of people where we went through the entire Bible, and I think it was like a year and a half, maybe, meeting once a week. It was great, and that was a safer space. There were a lot of other people in there who we could just let our guard down and we could have some really messy questions. And I think that that really held space for me to ask some of these questions and hear what other people were thinking and where there was alignment and where there wasn't. So I'm not exactly sure how long we stayed in that church after the doubts and the questions started, but my husband and I had a lot of decisions about it because again, there were people there who loved us. Our daughter almost died, and there were people who were at the hospital, even though it
Wow.
was an hour and a half away. There were people, um, there was someone who brought chocolate milk mix for my kids because they knew they liked that and they were here and mom was an hour away, right? People who really, really loved us in the hardest moments. So it wasn't easy to leave. But we did, and we just thought that it was because it was a predominantly white rural church in a sort of conservative denomination. So we went to a more progressive, non-denominational church in town, got into leadership real quick and saw some cracks there. And I think coming out of that, there was this really strange feeling of like, oh, maybe this is just how it is.
Mm.
And being very wounded and very exhausted, slid into a third church that was recommended to us by a friend who had grown up there and was really honest about the good, the bad, and the ugly. Just slid into that church on fumes. And I remember telling my husband, if this doesn't pan out, I'm done. And
Wow.
I don't know if that meant I was done with God, if I was done with church. Like, I don't even know what it meant. I just was so weary. And so
Can
that
you
church,
just can you
yeah,
describe that? Like, take us into that weariness, because
that
I
weariness.
don't
Yeah.
think you're alone, and I think a lot of people are feeling that right now.
Yeah. When between the second and third church, I think there was just a ton of grief and a ton of hopelessness of being able to find a space where we could exist and challenge things that I felt were harmful, right? I don't mind challenging, don't mind questioning, but it just felt like there were really significant consequences for asking the air quotes wrong question, right? Like doubt was welcome as long as it fit into a certain container. But
Oh
if
yeah.
you stepped beyond that container, like how many people can sit in a Bible study and say, I'm not even sure if God exists. I don't know. Right. Like that's a too far question in a lot
Sure.
of spaces.
Yep.
And so there was just this fatigue of like working so hard to understand a community and get into that community and then be let down and actually be actively harmed by the community that I don't even know how to explain that level of grief. It was also a time where my husband and I had suffered several losses. We had lost several grandparents that year. And so we were just overall
Mm,
grief stricken. There's
yeah.
no other way to say it. And I think that it was literally just going through the motions. We're going to try this again because it has great kids programming. Our friend trusts this space. Let's just go. And
Yeah.
we found some tremendous healing there, but I was still deconstructing. I was still questioning and challenging. But that was a space where there was a lot more room to do that. There was a
Yeah.
lot more permission to do that.
Interesting. Friends, I want to just point out one thing about the process of deconstructing, and it's this idea that you bring up, Angela, of grief, right? Like it
Mhm.
really is, especially if you're, like me, my wife and I both grew up in church. I've got a seminary education. Like I did all the things, right?
Mhm.
And then to start asking some questions, um, actually I would kind of always ask questions, which I think maybe why I never ended up in other certain places. But um it can be really disorienting, right? And
Yeah.
and you have to sort of grieve even some things that you believed, some things you did, some things you maybe said to people. Um, but also the sort of, but you talk about power, man. For me, one of the
Mhm.
biggest things was I read the book, The 48 Laws of Power. Do you know this book? With
I do not know that book.
I can't recommend it to you. It's horrible. It's a horrible book. It's a book of manipulation. I
Gotcha.
picked
So
it up.
almost like what is it? How to win friends and influence people, same
Yes,
kind of
right.
thing. Like, here's how to manipulate people.
I
Got it.
picked it up because I heard it was banned in prison. I was like, I want to read that now. So I picked it up, and 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 I think I only read half of it. But once I got, like, I started seeing, as he's describing these different ways that people would use power,
Hmm.
I recognized them, right? Like I recognized
Yeah.
them from my time in church and with Christian people. And it just kind of, it just kind of broke something in me for that. And it was, but grief is the only correct word to describe that feeling, right? And so
Yeah.
grief is nonlinear. Grief has all kinds of various feelings and emotions. So, friends, you may be experiencing those, and if you are, take note and be honest about it,
Right.
and dive into that. Okay, so you finally
Yeah.
go to this new church,
Yep.
and you're finding a place where you can at least ask these questions, and that's okay.
Yeah. And the beauty of this new church was that there was a pretty significant social justice focus. And so we were able to talk about racism, we were able to talk about xenophobia, able to talk about some of these things, right? And really wise leadership and not just like head knowledge, smart people, but people who were brilliant and humble enough to say, I don't know.
Hmm.
Humble enough. I mean, how many times do you have a lead pastor who's over a denomination that is, or over a church that's kind of the flagship of that whole denomination, be able to look at you and just say, well, that's really messy. I don't think I have an answer for that. What do you think? Like, just beautiful examples of leadership. And even though I'm not 100% in line with the doctrine of that church, it's still consider it my home church. Um, there are a lot of questions that were coming up for me around gender bias in the church, even though it's a denomination that affirms women. I was in seminary at the time. I was doing a research project on women in leadership and did they have opportunities and mentoring and all of this. And I think the thing that really catapulted my grief was hearing from women who were very high up in different denominations who affirmed women in leadership, um, talk about how they were still being left out, how they were still being left out of meetings and decision making and talked over, and things that I didn't think would happen at that level. And it kind of shattered this idea that if I tried really hard and I got smarter and I learned the things and I stayed in the community, that those wouldn't be issues, that I could really thrive. And so if that was happening, if we were getting that wrong, what else could we be getting wrong? Like if that little amount of harm was happening to me, what harm am I doing without realizing it? And again, it's good people, right? It's people you love and respect who are just getting things wrong. Then you have to look in the mirror and say, okay, what am I getting wrong? Who am I harming? And that's where I just had to take a step back and really get honest with myself and really grieve that sort of false perception of what the church is on earth and what the reality is and how messy and complicated we all are.
Yeah. Yeah, kind of accepting that, right? So one of the reasons I started this show, I say all the time, is because when I was a kid, the story was my life was terrible. Then I met Jesus. Now my life is great.
Yep.
Right? Which that makes a nice little bow, and it's awesome, except for all the other things that happen in life.
Right.
Like everything else. And actually it's documented. God's people for millennia that has not been their experience, right? Life is not just great after you meet Jesus. So, for you, so you're asking these questions.
Yeah.
When did you, how did that describe that season more for you? Like, how did you kind of move through it? How long did it last? What, what conclusions did you come to? And, give us kind of some of that story.
Yeah. So kind of the timeline from when I first started asking those questions and started having a little bit of dissonance until I really got up to my eyeballs and made some hard decisions, right? Really got into it was probably 10 years. And I'm sure people who are listening are like, oh my goodness, 10 years.
Yeah.
But what the little asterisk I want to put on that is that it wasn't 10 years of utter chaos, right? It was a little bit of doubt building. It's kind of like grief. You said it's not linear. I would say there were a couple of really hard years. I'd say there were probably about 3 to 4 really hard years of trying to sort things out. And this is coming from somebody who's really smart and really stubborn and tends to put things off as long as possible. So for other people, it doesn't always take that long, right?
Wait, so you were resisting it a little bit, trying to say like, okay, how do I do this?
I think on a subconscious level, I was like, there has to be an answer. Like when we bopped from the first church to the second, like, oh, it's just this church, right? This isn't a universal thing. I'll get a bachelor's in biblical studies and that will help me understand this. Oh, okay. Well, I'm going to go to seminary because I'm obviously being called to the pulpit and then getting really mad and being like, hey, God, why do I not have a church? I've worked my tail end off here. Right. And just realizing that it wasn't like a gumball machine sort of thing where you do this and this happens. You do X and Y happens. You do something good and you get this reward. Like that's where I really started to understand how much I was chasing the legalism and the affirmation and the acceptance in ways that didn't actually represent who I was pretty sure God was. And pretty sure Jesus was, and pretty sure that like things were supposed to be. And I had to reconcile that with myself first, right? It wasn't like, hey, let's go change the church. It was, there's a dissonance in me that I don't understand. And I need to sit with myself and kind of lower the walls and figure out what the heck is going on there. And then go out and get information and then talk to people and listen to people and seek mentoring and those kind of things. And so that's where it got really hard. I mean, being honest with yourself is the hardest thing. It just really is.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's true for any journey, right? Being honest with yourself about
Absolutely.
what it is you want and what it is that you actually are believing or thinking about. Yeah, which can be actually the toughest part altogether.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. Did you try to change the church? A lot of people try to do that. Like, I'm just going to get more involved and then I'll just change it.
In the first church, yes. In the second church, yes. In the third church, I think part of the reason that I was attracted to it and my husband was attracted to it was because it's a large church. And so it's not the kind that's putting pressure on you constantly to join
Yeah.
into things. And I think that I was really honest, especially with the children's ministry. I told the children's pastor, I was like, you can ask all you want, but this is what we're coming out of. And until there's some healing, I'm going to say no, but you can keep asking if you want my help. Like if I have the bandwidth, I will. And they really honored that, like really honored that in a way that I mean, that ministered to me probably more than anything else that's ever
Mm,
happened.
yeah.
Um, just honoring the messiness and honoring the rawness that we walked in the door with without pushing us into certain activities
Yeah.
or saying, if you get in a Sunday school class, it'll help with that. Right. Um, so yes, to some extent, but as I grew a little bit wiser, I realized that being a small cog in a big machine is sometimes you pay a higher cost than you would if you stepped out and caught your breath and then kind of address the issues.
Yeah.
So a lot of us don't do a lot of us want the church to be so healthy. Like we want it so bad because we see the potential of what could happen if we're all like Jesus, right? But we stay in abusive situations. We stay in unhealthy situations. We reinforce existing imbalances of power because we stay in it rather than stepping out, doing our own work, getting therapy, doing our grieving, whatever it is we need to do,
Yeah.
probably all of the above. That's my story. And then saying, okay, I do have influence. Where do I want to use that influence?
Yeah.
Who is in a position of power that I can actually connect with? And what change can I create realistically? Rather than I'm going to go to the top of the food chain and
Right.
and like turn the whole thing. Like we have to avoid absolutism when we're trying to create change. Otherwise, we're just going to run ourselves into the ground and we're not going to create meaningful change. And we're probably going to step on some people in the process.
Right. Yeah, that's one of the hard parts too, I think. As I've kind of done this and I interact with people going through deconstruction, it's easy to maintain being a fundamentalist,
Mm-hmm.
but just for different issues, right?
Absolutely.
That can happen a lot too, and that's not better, right? It's just a different side of the coin.
Absolutely. And I think that's why I work so hard to tell people that, especially my clients and the people that are in my online community, like I'm not actually here to tell you what to believe.
Yeah.
And some of my clients have gotten a little mad at that and come back later and they're like, thank you for that. But I make a point of saying, if you just adopt what I believe, it's just a different system. It's not
Yeah.
actually uprooting uprooting harmful beliefs and developing a belief system where you can actually flourish. It's just going from one talking head to another. And
Yeah.
that's not deconstruction.
Wow. That's good. What did you learn about yourself in that process?
Oof, that's a whole nother book. that's probably like an encyclopedia set. I think what I learned the most was how much my pursuit of connection was driven by trauma. So in hindsight, I now have a diagnosis of PTSD. I have a diagnosis of bipolar. I've done a lot of work where I can go back and I can see that some of the unhealthy stuff that happened in those church environments was actually due to the unhealed stuff in me. And that doesn't mean abuse is ever anyone's fault, right? It's never a victim's fault. What I recognize is that I really sucked at putting healthy boundaries in place. And because of that, there was more harm done because I was tolerating things that no human being should tolerate. So learning how my brain is wired, learning how I'm wired emotionally has helped me
Mhm.
take a step back and say, how do I want to walk through the world? And then how does that connect with faith?
Yeah.
Rather than just saying faith, faith is a good thing. I want to go out and build it at all costs. I've had to take a step back and be like, okay, there's always a cost. What is an appropriate cost for developing a flourishing spiritual life versus what is something that is just going to drain me and cause harm?
Yeah. That's really interesting. I love that because I think that is part of it. I don't think many of us get this. Goes back to what you said earlier about smaller churches, right? Like
Mhm.
I grew up in churches where if you were enthusiastic, you were called, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Well, you go do it then, right? It was one of those deals, and that leads to burnout and you know using
Absolutely.
people, all of those things. That's interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so one of the things that I'm really interested in about your book, again, it's called Deconstructing Your Faith Without Losing Yourself. Um, I make a lot of people mad when I talk about people having a self and self being good, right? Like,
Yep.
which is astounding to me and the evangelical community. Like, how do we think that taking care of yourself is not a good thing? It just doesn't make any sense to me at all. Because Jesus has a self, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
He took care of himself. He would get away. Like we'll preach that, but
Yeah.
then when other people want to do it and it doesn't fit in your agenda, people get mad and all of that. So going through this process, and I can tell you, I'm sure you probably heard all of the things about people from people with concerns about deconstruction and concerns
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
about selfishness and like self-compassion, like all that.
Yeah.
Um, but so what are your like if you were to some of our listeners, if they were going through deconstruction, maybe like you resisting it or feeling like I got some questions, but maybe it's not, that important. What would you tell them, particularly about how to hold on to themselves, or
Yeah.
maybe how to maybe even discover themselves? Because that's one of the things that Dark Knight does, right? And
Right.
I think deconstruction is a dark night. It God uses it to reveal who we are, so that then, sort of like you, we can then come out on the other side in a place where we can actually serve according to our actual gifting, not according to all the things the church had given us, right? And that's what you're doing now.
Right.
You're helping people in your gifting in ways that you probably
Right.
couldn't have done before.
Yeah. And I think the key that I really want people to take away from this is that the more you try to outrun yourself, the more damage you're actually doing to yourself. So
Wow.
if people are like self-care, like all these buzzwords that started as really genuine, compassionate things, if people are like, those are really harmful, those are really selfish, I would ask where you learned that. And then my friend Amanda Walren, who's also a coach, always says, who does that serve? Who benefits from that? And I think understanding that even with the best of intentions, the majority, I'm going to go out on a limb, the majority of our religious communities are unhealthy. And there's this, so exploiting free labor, exploiting your time, exploiting your
Yeah.
efforts is what keeps a lot of churches together, especially for women. It just really is, right?
Yeah. Yep.
And so when we're talking about self, I would challenge people to say, why do I think self is bad? What does that actually mean? And the truth is a lot of us have been conditioned to believe that our heart is untrustworthy, our minds
Yeah.
are untrustworthy. As human beings, we are totally rotten from the inside out. And I that's flawed. I know there are some there are some
Yep.
denominations that just shut off the podcast. They're like, nope, that's too far. And that's okay if that's where you're at right now. But I would ask it, who do you believe God to be? Is God a compassionate um, Father who created us so that we could exist in relationship, why would we be rotten? How could we actually contain the breath of God and be rotten on the inside? Right. And I think those are the strings you start to tug on when you're having this conversation about what is taking care of myself and honoring myself as a human being that has needs versus I'm just being selfish. And sometimes people talk about it as being lazy. Like you're not disciplined enough to extend yourself in this way. It's messy, but it's
an interesting
really important
connection too. Like if we think people who have needs is bad, right? I can see a direct line to how that leads to, well, we're not going to put the elevator in for the people in our community that need it. Right.
Yeah.
Because they don't really need it. They just think that, right. Like
it's not a big deal, right?
Yeah,
it's not our responsibility as a church to meet those needs.
Right.
And that's where, to me, that's where someone's testimony kind of starts to fall apart. Like, yeah, here I am to do these things and here's my story. And yet I'm only going to turn around and do the same thing to other people. I'm going to give them what I needed, not necessarily support them by asking what they need and then offering that, even if it's really uncomfortable for me.
Yeah. Wow. That's so powerful. Okay. Well, this is certainly one of my hobby horses. I think caring for yourself, and one of those things might be admitting that you're having some questions, you're having some doubts. People go through different paths as they go through that. What are some of the paths that you see people take when you work with them as a deconstruction coach, which is a fascinating term? So tell us kind of what you do with that too.
Yeah. So from what I think, the gift of deconstruction coaching is having someone hold space for you without pushing an agenda, right? Without trying to convert someone, without, telling them, hey, this is right, this is wrong. Do I have very strong opinions on what's good and bad and right and wrong? Absolutely. But in a coaching relationship, a good coaching relationship, not everybody does it this way. In a good coaching relationship, the space is for the individual to explore what they believe. My agenda doesn't matter. The only part of my agenda that matters is holding space for this person to do whatever they need to do. And so the path looks radically different for everyone, but I think there are a few consistencies up front that most people will probably say, yeah, I did that. And the first one is learning to listen to myself, learning to trust myself, learning to be in my body without feeling that shame, without saying, okay, but if I listen to my gut, God's going to be really mad at me. And also I'm going to burn in hell. Oh yeah. And I'm a parent, so I'm probably going to take my kids with me because that's what we've been taught. Right. So rewiring our brains to cherish our bodies and to see all the parts of us as sacred and holy sounds like a small thing, but it takes years sometimes. It is, the longer you've been in an environment that tells you you're bad, the longer it's going to take for you to find your own goodness. So that's kind of one of the things that's really common. And then the other piece, because I work with a lot of women, predominantly white women who've been in leadership. That's just like, we're always drawn to people that are like us, right?
Yep.
So a lot of my clients really get into deconstruction, really start questioning what's happening, start looking around at the harm that's being done, and have this sort of wall that they hit when they start to realize how much harm they were doing in their leadership positions, whether it was a youth leader or pastor or even in AA and some of those other spaces, trying to help people in ways that the church said was good was actually doing harm.
Yeah.
That is a humbling experience because it's really hard to dehumanize people who are on other sides of the issue when you realize how much you've harmed people.
Yeah.
Because like the enemy, right? The person who's doing the harm over there, they're a monster. Oh, but wait, was I a monster when I was doing that? Or was I just spreading the only thing I knew? And so those are the two things that I think are pretty consistent. How and when and the order and all of that is totally different. Just depends on where you're starting from and where you've been and what how high up your walls are at that point.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah. Do you find where do people usually end up? Do you think, like, where do you, and maybe you don't have a goal, like you don't have an agenda for that, but what do you see kind of as the outcomes that people tend to have once they go through deconstruction?
I don't know that there is an end up, right? There's just a being. There's just a, how do you walk through life sort of thing. And this will really scare some people, but I don't know that deconstruction ever actually ends, because it's a process of examining what you believe and sifting and sorting and just being curious. And so for most of us, I hope that will continue all the way up through the end of life. It's kind of in the middle, like where do people land in the middle? I think you get to a place where you have had the space to release your rage. You've had the space to grieve. For a lot of us, that takes a lot of therapy. So yes, coaching, but also therapy. Like do both if you can squeeze it into your budget. Because on the other side of that, there is a whole lot of space to just be and not spend every moment of the day wondering if you have the right answers, wondering if you're, am I in the lines? Am I coloring outside the lines? What's going to happen? And there's a lot of flourishing there, even though there's still a lot of uncertainty. And that is a real beautiful thing to see people get into. That's where a lot of times I will say, hey, this is where you're at. You don't need me to hold space for you, because you're in a place where you can hold space for yourself.
Yeah.
Go have fun. Go, whatever that looks like for you, go have fun.
Yeah. Interesting. I like that. Yeah. And that's good. Ultimately, I think you're right. There's some pathways there. I see a few different ways that people go that I kind of have categorized into certain things, but that's may or may not be helpful as well. So interesting. All right. So I'm really fascinated by your book, Deconstructing Your Faith Without Losing Yourself. Friends, it is out now, so you can get it anywhere you get your books. There's links at halfwaytherepodcast.com. Your website is right here, Angela J. Herrington. Is that right? .com?
Yep, AngelaJHarrington.com. And it's Herrington with an E, not an A.
There you go. Excellent. And friends, that's again all linked at halfwaytherepodcast.com. You can get it, pick it up. If you're asking those questions, or you know somebody who's asking those questions and just needs some space, maybe a little bit of permission to be yourself, seems like a great book to pick up and spend a little time with. Angela, thanks for being here, sharing a little bit of your story. Is there anything you want to leave us with?
I think no matter where people are at, I would just say, find yourself. Find yourself. Find ways to listen to yourself and to trust yourself, even if you don't have the answers. Because the truth is, none of us have all the answers, right? But just learn how to settle into your body and start to believe that maybe there's goodness in you, even if you don't have all the right answers.
Yeah, you went there a little bit. I did not ask too many questions, but man, the body piece is a huge piece for kind of diving into that, and it's often where some of this starts for people, right? So
yeah,
I love that. All right, Angela, thanks for being here. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.